When I looked at the title, I also thought, that's a strange title. Why transparency? So last night, Mona gave me my marching orders, what I should say. I thought about them, and I decided to do a little bit what will make her happy and a little bit what will probably annoy her. I'll speak from a global perspective, despite the fact that I think that a global perspective in these days are also part of the problem. And you'll see in a moment why I get there. I'll talk about the good, the bad, and the simple. Starting with the good. At the end of last year, I think the anti-corruption world were in ecstasy. To some extent, what we've been fighting for the last 25, 30 years seemed to have come to fruition. We have both an international legal framework in place through the United Nations Convention. We have the OECD Convention that should control bribery and the destruction, particularly done by rich countries across the world, to those that are poorer. And we have a Agenda 2030 that are much more progressive and much more dealing with the common social good than what we probably could have imagined 4 years ago. 4 years ago, about 10 of us from international civil society met with Ban Ki-moon. And we gave him 6 things that we wanted, particularly the SDGs, but in broader the Agenda 2030 to satisfy for us to support it. We said Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals have to be universal. This idea of a development paradigm that divides the world into north-south was passé. We said it had to deal with inequality. It had to do with human rights and really advance those. It had to be with sustainability, participation, accountability. And when we met with him at the end of last year, we had to say, well, to our surprise, of course it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what we could have expected. It seemed that somehow we achieved to come together and put the global social good above national interests. That's a year ago, end of September. And in Paris in December, we continued along that road. Then comes 2016. For that you'll have to wait, because there's more good news first. During 2015, 2016, and the last couple of years, the battle for transparency has indeed gone from an issue that in 2007, which feels like 20 years ago for me, when people said corruption, transparency, accountability, these were niche issues. These were issues that some weird academics, some fringe journalists, and some NGO types that didn't really know what to struggle for better were really interested in. This was not a mass issue. This transparency was not something that could really mobilize people. It's amazing, because if you look back over the last 2 years and you think of the 20 most biggest popular uprisings in the world, think of South Africa, my own country, Guatemala, Mexico, Romania, Moldova, Malaysia, South Korea. All of them have, maybe 2 of them are slightly different, but all of these have in common that ordinary people saying we've had enough of this nonsense. We've had enough of corruption. We've had enough of the abuse of power. We've had enough of secrecy was a common driver. And what is particularly encouraging is that this outrage against corruption takes place across all political and social divides. This is not an issue that follow the normal divides as what we see with many other social issues. It takes across those divides. So that is arguably the issue, because of this massive grassroots support, that the battle for transparency and accountability will be won. It is a given. It doesn't mean it will be easy. It doesn't mean it will happen tomorrow. It's a little bit like, as a teenager in South Africa, I realized apartheid will end. I didn't know whether it will be in 5 years or 10 years or 50 years. At some stage I thought it will be 50. Because when you had all the powerful countries in the world, Western powers, supporting a regime that was so abusive of human rights and corrupt, it seemed in a way impossible that it could end soon. But I knew it would end. And similar with our battle for corruption, the massive public uprisings are there. The question for us as activists is, how do we actually not lead that battle? That is a myth. We don't lead public uprisings. We don't lead the public opinion. Our task is one, how can we actually use this groundswell of public opinion and channel it into sustainable choice? And I'll come to that in a moment. All of this optimism seemed to have, to some extent, fainted what in 2016 became to feel like a total eclipse of the sun. Across the world, and it's not only in the US, that is the greatest myth, that this popular uprising, anti-establishment, anti-globalization, anti-internationalism, that this is to be concealed to the US and to Brexit. It happens across the world. My own country, South Africa, far away there on the southern tip of Africa, have seen the most disgusting, xenophobic, inward-looking discourses since I'm alive. In this year, we have a huge divide opening up between those that are considered to be part of the establishment or the elites and those that are seen as the rest of the population. A divide which exposes a major breakdown of trust in political systems, in financial systems, be they national or international, and a breakdown in trust where the establishment are seen as both influencing and setting the rules of national and global financial and political systems from which they themselves then disproportionately benefit. A system that fuels inequality, a system that enables aggressive anti-social secrecy as illustrated by the Panama Papers. There is nothing harmless about so-called tax havens. Those are criminal havens. If in any other way you look at it, you deny the fact that in what is harmlessly called tax evasion is nothing but theft from the public purse. Theft that is enabled by laws, rules, regulations set by those that then benefit from them. This mistrust from very large sections of the population is further fueled by the fact that those that are also now widely recognized as continuously abusing their power, such as the banks, continue to get away with fines that are nothing but a little bump in the road for their operations. If you think about it, over the last 5-6 years, over $250 billion have been paid by the banks in fines. Those fines, although the victims of what the banks that often sit in the so-called South, continued to actually fuel the coffers in the North. It is hard for people to accept that this international system of corruption continues to have victims that primarily affect those that are poorer, whether they sit in the so-called South or in richer countries, and continue to benefit also the majority of people in this room. Our pension funds are protected by what the European Union does when it bails out Greek banks or Irish banks. We are not harmless in this. We might be fighting the battle against it, but we are also part of this system, disproportionately favoring also us. And that's one of the dangers, where we continue to look at this wave of anti-establishment that rolls across us, not to realize that for the absolute majority of people in those movements, organized civil society, journalists, academia are part of that system. That's quite tough, because all the time we thought we had the moral high ground. We are rapidly losing that. And if you look at trends and attitudes across the world, it is only a matter of time before that same truck will hit us, in my view. But this mistrust in the system is in some ways, even when you look at it, fueled by a political class that continues to articulate economic growth of 2 or 3% as huge achievements, whilst the fact that many economies lose through illicit flows, corruption, money laundering, 2, 5, 7% of GDP, and that is seen as just the cost of doing business. It is so ridiculous that you sometimes wonder how there can be any faith in political systems. Our own research over the years have shown that particularly when you look at mistrust in political systems, political parties and parliaments, and you start to dissect for age, people over the age of 40 and particularly over the age of 50, so many people in this room, have a relatively high degree of trust in those. But people under the age of 40 and particularly under the age of 30 across the world have virtually no trust in parliaments, political parties, political systems. The gulf is the biggest. Those people have much more trust in business than what they have in politics, which doesn't surprise one when you see how out of touch also organized civil society are with what is happening in terms of popular opinion around us. And it doesn't get much better, I'm afraid. For years we've been talking about how the space of civil society is shrinking. In the last year or two, that has become a total misnomer. Because what you have, and that is again across the world, with very few exceptions, including also the Scandinavian countries, where you have an increased attack on civil liberties, where journalists are intimidated, where you have administrative controls being increased. And this attack on civil liberties, much more than the closing space of organized civil society, is the one that fundamentally undermines the quest for democracy, fundamentally undermines human rights, and makes the battle for transparency so much more difficult. There, the political elites have realized exactly what I said 10 minutes ago. This is unstoppable, because once you have this mass of public support for it, it will lead to a quest for much greater transparency. And that has been closed down by attack on civil liberties. When journalists, and I've seen that across the world, including in Scandinavian countries, when journalists are visited late at night by police officials, when they are intimidated in terms of what they write that is clearly in the public interest, that is not the kind of society we thought we would be living in a few years ago. And yet, there's also some simple things that are emerging of changes. And I'll talk to two of those very briefly. When TI started, it had a very strong belief that you had to tackle systems. That without dealing with systems, you could not bring about a change that was sustainable. That remains true, but it's only part of the truth. Because dealing with systems have shown to be something that can take extremely long, and in that battle, you might well lose a lot of ground if you don't also tackle those that are the direct beneficiaries, in other words, the corrupt. And that's why in TI, in the last few years, we've made two quite significant changes to how we tackle this. The one is that you have to focus on the grand corrupt. You have to pursue them. And that's why we, in addition to our quite well-known definition of corruption as the abuse of entrusted power, also came up with a definition of grand corruption. I don't want to go through that process again, working with international lawyers for 2 years to get there. I tell you, that made me old. But grand corruption being those that are entrusted with high-level power that actually abuse that to the benefit of the few and to the harm of many. In that sense, it is unmistakable today that when you look at corruption, it's indeed a crime against society. And to not pursue that in a very forceful way will continue to undermine the trust in terms of looking at pursuing those that are involved with low-level corruption and allowing those that are major beneficiaries from grand corruption to continue to get away with it. Secondly, we've made a shift to increasingly focus on those that enable and facilitate corruption. The estate agents, the lawyers, the ones that are often seen as so-called these people in the middle. My own continent, Africa, today suffers a wealth stripping on a daily basis that is dramatically worse than the wealth stripping that occurred during colonialism and slavery. For every dollar that comes in, $7 go out. Through illicit flows, through money laundering, through corruption. That is shocking. Because during colonialism, everybody knew slavery was brutal. Now it appears so incredibly harmless. But the consequences on my continent is worse than what it was then. And that's why if you don't close down these loopholes, if you don't close down the tax havens, it is impossible to deal with it. And let me tell a short story, because as an African I cannot go through this whole thing without telling a short story. Many of you will remember that in June this year, Prime Minister Cameron had a conference in London where he brought many people together, and on the morning of the conference he was visiting the Queen, and he was caught off camera where he, in very eloquent language, told the Queen that he's bringing together very fantastically corrupt people from Afghanistan and Nigeria. So you can imagine that, given that we were one of the co-organizers of this, that within 20 minutes, all of the news media was all over the story, and I'll tell you what I said then on the big so-called news media. I said, oh, yes, of course it is correct that Afghanistan, Nigeria have serious corruption problems. It's a pity that the Prime Minister didn't also welcome people to the City of London. Arguably one of the most problematic criminal centers in the world. I did tell them that I offered to write his opening speech for the conference with the words, "Welcome to the City of London, the center of criminal investment. David Cameron, will do something about it." Downing Street 10 turned that offer down, I have to say. But the bottom line remains that as long as these centers exist in the way that they do, all our fights to stop corruption at the local level will be undermined. So in terms of secrecy and lack of transparency, and why transparency, I need to finish off, and I'll get very simple. Two very simple things. You've all heard about it, but I would nevertheless want to say it again, because very often we are confronted by people telling us this issue is so complex, there's nothing you can do that will make a big difference in the next 10 years. There are, both in terms when you look at the business community and when you look at politics, there are two incredible simple things that can be done in 2017. Firstly, on companies, it'll be no surprise to you when I talk about public registers of beneficial ownership. My mother always tells me that every single public contract in South Africa is corrupt. They are just skimming it all off. And then she finds it very unacceptable that I try to defend it and say, no, it's not all of them. But clearly, to the South African government, it's very simple. You can actually deal with both the reality of many of that being the case, as well as the perception, by requiring, in the month of January, all companies that bid for public contracts to have public registers of beneficial ownership. It's possible. It's not difficult. It can be done instantly. It will have a dramatic impact. Public registers of beneficial ownership can be put in place in all countries around the world in one single year. And the argument against it is so ridiculous. I often hear, well, if we close it down here, this money will go somewhere else. That's what the Panamese told me. That's what the British Virgin Islands tell me. It's a little bit like me saying to the judge, you know, if I didn't steal that camera, somebody else would. It's ridiculous. I am protecting other territories from criminal behavior by accepting that it could come to me. We often hear that there's a security issue. It's too dangerous to have this in the public domain. Yet, when you look at companies, you can look in the telephone directory, who runs them, who's the CEO, etc. This model that you have owners that are hidden and those that run it in the public domain is a well-known model. It's called organized crime. when the German government was against beneficial ownership, I asked Angela Merkel whether she would ever get on an aeroplane if there's no passenger list. And there was no basic due diligence on the luggage security. And she said, of course not, that's crazy. I said, so why do you allow secret companies to undermine your economy? That is as crazy. It is possible to deal with that. I've got a 1 minute sign, so now I'm in a... It's possible to do. On politicians, often those tell me that, again, this argument, it will take a long time, and I say, no. If you tomorrow morning make a public asset, interest, and income declaration, require all those that work with public money in your administration to do the same, it will build trust in an incredible fast way. It's doable. Of course, this year we saw a president-elect Trump to refuse to even put his tax returns in the public domain. I think it's for a country such as Norway to say whoever works with public money should have in the public domain publicly their interest, asset, and income declarations. It just doesn't make sense if you work with public money not to do it. In a time when everybody is abusing and using the discourse of transparency, from the most revered and respected to the most populist, the need for a very bold, strong, and rational discourse on transparency is absolutely needed. As a young activist, our battle cry was in South Africa, we wanted those in power, we wanted to have the right to speak truth to power. That is what we got up in the morning, we fought for. I think we now live in a time where it's exactly the opposite, where we say we demand that those in power speak truth to us. That's why transparency and the battle for it will remain one that we have to accept. We cannot have the optimism that we had a year ago, but surely the broad public support to say we've had enough of this abuse and secrecy remains there, and that's what should inspire us. Thank you very much.